Imagine your life without fear. Not fear managed, not fear controlled, not fear you've learned to live with and carry around like a weight you've gotten used to, but fear completely gone. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and for the first time in as long as you can remember, the voice that tells you you're not ready, not good enough, not capable enough, simply isn't there. What would you do with that morning? What decision would you finally make? What conversation would you finally have? What door would you finally kick open that you've been standing in front of for months, maybe years, telling yourself that someday, when you feel more ready, when the timing is better, when the fear goes away, you'll finally walk through? Because here is what nobody tells you about that door. The fear is never going to go away on its own. Not if you wait long enough. Not if you think about it hard enough. Not if you prepare for long enough. Not if you read enough books or listen to enough people tell you that you can do it. The fear is not going to disappear while you're standing still. But here is what James Allen understood, something so simple and so precise that most people miss it entirely. The fear doesn't have to disappear for your life to change. You just have to stop obeying it. That's it. That is the whole shift, not becoming fearless in the way most people imagine it, not waking up one day with no fear left, but making a decision, a real and conscious decision, that the fear gets to exist, it gets to show up, it gets to make its noise, but it does not get to decide. Not anymore. James Allen wrote that a man is literally what he thinks, and most people who live in fear live there not because the world is genuinely dangerous, but because they have practiced day after day, year after year, the thought that it is. They have rehearsed the worst outcome so many times that the brain accepts it as inevitable. And from that acceptance, the fear grows. And from that fear, the stillness comes. And from that stillness, the life they were meant to live stays exactly where it has always been, just out of reach, just on the other side of the door they never walked through. But you are here right now, which means something in you knows that doesn't have to be the story. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand not just why the fear has had so much power over you, but exactly how to take that power back. Not someday, not when you feel ready. Now, let's get something clear first. Fear is not your enemy. Most people spend their lives treating fear like a disease, something to be cured, something to be eliminated, something that has no business existing inside a person who wants to live well. But that's not what fear is, and fighting it that way is exactly why most people never win. Fear is instinct. It is ancient. It is wired into you at a level deeper than thought, deeper than choice, deeper than anything you can simply decide to turn off. And in many ways, it has served you well. It has kept you cautious when caution was needed. It has slowed you down when slowing down was the right thing to do. It has protected you from real dangers in a world that has real dangers in it. Fear is not the problem. Obeying it is. There is a difference, a massive difference, between feeling fear and letting fear decide, between the signal rising in your chest and handing that signal the wheel of your entire life. Most people never learn to make that distinction. They feel the fear and they treat it as a command, as a verdict, as proof that the thing they want is not meant for them, as a message from somewhere deep inside that says, not you, not this, not now. But James Allen was very clear about where that message actually comes from. It comes from thought, specifically from habitual thought, from the thoughts you have repeated so many times, so automatically, so unconsciously, that they have stopped feeling like thoughts and started feeling like truth. He wrote that the outer conditions of a person's life will always be found to reflect their inner beliefs. And what most people who live in fear have been believing, deep down where they can't easily see it, is that the world is more dangerous than it is, that they are less capable than they are, that failure is more permanent than it is, and that the cost of trying is higher than the cost of not trying. None of that is true, but it feels true because it has been practiced, and the mind is not easily distinguished between what is real and what has simply been repeated enough times to feel real. This is where most people are stuck, not in the fear itself, but in the story the fear has been telling them for years. And here is the contrast that matters. Most people hear that story and nod along. They accept it as fact. They build their life around it. They make decisions based on it. They shrink to fit inside it. And then years later, they wonder why the life they're living feels so much smaller than the one they imagined. But the people who move, the ones who build things, who start things, who say the thing and take the risk and walk through the door, they hear the same story. They feel the same fear. The fear doesn't skip them. It never skips anyone. The only difference is they stop treating the story as truth. They learn to hear the fear and ask, is this actually true, or is this just familiar? Because familiar and true are not the same thing. And James Allen understood that the moment you start questioning the story, the moment you stop accepting fear's script as reality, something shifts. Not the circumstances, not the world outside you, but something inside, something in the quality of your thinking, in the way you hold the fear, in the distance between the feeling and the response. That distance, that tiny space between the fear rising and the decision about what to do with it, that is where your power lives. And most people have never even noticed it exists. So let me ask you something directly. What story has fear been telling you? Not in general, specifically about your life, about what you're capable of, about what's possible for someone like you. What has it been whispering day after day in the background of every decision you've made and every risk you haven't taken? Because that story, however familiar it feels, however true it sounds, is not a fact. It is a habit, and habits can be changed. Now let's talk about the only thing that actually kills fear. Not thinking about it differently, not understanding it better, not reading about it or listening to someone explain why you shouldn't have it. The only thing that actually kills fear is exposure. Doing the thing while afraid and surviving it, and then doing it again and surviving that too, and then doing it again until the brain finally receives the message it has been waiting for all along. This is not as dangerous as I thought. That is the mechanism. That is how fear actually shrinks, not through insight, not through preparation, not through waiting until you feel ready, but through repeated action in the presence of the fear itself, until the fear stops feeling like a wall and starts feeling like weather. Something that's there, something you notice, but something you walk through anyway. James Allen wrote that strength can only be developed by effort and practice. And what most people don't realize is that this applies not just to physical strength, not just to skill, but to courage itself. Courage is not something you have or you don't. It is something you build rep by rep, action by action, every time you feel the fear and move anyway. Think about the first time you ever did something that scared you, really scared you, something that made your heart race and your hands shake and a voice inside you screamed that this was a terrible idea. Now, think about the 10th time you did that same thing. Different, wasn't it? Not because the thing changed, but because you changed, because your nervous system had been through it enough times to know that the threat your brain had been advertising was exaggerated, that the worst-case scenario your mind had been rehearsing was not the inevitable outcome, that you were more capable than the fear had been telling you. That is exposure. That is how it works, and it works every single time, without exception, for every person in every situation. The first time is terrifying, the second time is uncomfortable, the 10th time is routine, and the 100th time is freedom. But most people never get to the 10th time because they stop at the first, or they never even start because they are waiting for the fear to go away before they take the first step. And that wait, as James Allen understood, is the most expensive thing a person can do with their life. There was a man named James, not the philosopher, a different James, a man who had spent 12 years in the same job, a job he was good at, a job that paid the bills, a job that had nothing to do with the thing he actually wanted to build. He wanted to start his own business. He had wanted it for 12 years. He had thought about it constantly, planned in his head, talked about it to his wife on Sunday evenings when the week hadn't started yet, and anything still felt possible. But every time he got close to actually doing something, the fear arrived, loud and specific and convincing. What if it fails? What if you lose everything? What if you're not as good as you think? What if you try and the world confirms your worst fear about yourself, that you're not enough? And he would listen, and he would wait, and another year would pass. One evening, his oldest daughter asked him what his dream was. She was 12 years old, and she asked it with the casual curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned that dreams are supposed to be embarrassing. And he told her about the business, about the idea he had been carrying for 12 years. And she looked at him and said, "So why don't you just do it?" No analysis, no understanding of the risks, no appreciation for all the very reasonable reasons why it was complicated. Just that question, asked by someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of the answer. James sat with that question for 3 days. And then he did something small, not the whole business, not the leap, just one small thing. He sent one email to one potential client, one sentence, just to see what would happen. Nothing happened, no response, no dramatic result, but something shifted in him because he had done it. He had moved despite the fear, and the world had not ended, and he was still standing. So he sent another email, and then another, and then he made a phone call, and then another, and slowly, month by month, the thing he had been afraid of for 12 years started to become familiar, and familiar things are not frightening. 2 years later, he had left the job. The business was real, not perfect, not without struggle, but real, built not in a moment of fearlessness, but in hundreds of small moments of being afraid and moving anyway. James Allen wrote that the vision that you glorify in your mind, the ideal that you enthrone in your heart, this you will build your life by, and this you will become. But what James discovered, the man with the daughter, is that you cannot build toward a vision you are too afraid to take one step toward. The vision stays a dream until you move. And you don't have to move perfectly. You don't have to move with certainty. You don't have to move without fear. You just have to move. So here's the question I want you to sit with right now. What is the one step, the smallest possible step, that you have been afraid to take? Not the whole journey, not the finished version, just the first step, the one that feels manageable if you're honest, the one you could actually take today if you decided to. Because that step is where everything begins. Not in some dramatic moment of transformation, not when the fear finally goes away, not when the conditions are finally perfect. In one small movement, taken while afraid, that tells your brain something it desperately needs to hear. We do this. We move even when it's uncomfortable. We step forward even when we're not sure. We begin even when we can't see the end. And the more you teach your brain that lesson, the less fear has to say about what you do next. Now we get to the part that most people skip, and skipping it is exactly why the fear keeps coming back. Because exposure will reduce the fear, the evidence is clear on that. The practice works, the mechanism is real. But if you don't deal with what's happening inside your mind, and the thoughts you're running day and night without even noticing, the fear will keep regenerating, keep rebuilding itself, keep finding new ways to convince you that the step you're about to take is the one that will finally break you. James Allen was more direct about this than almost anyone who ever wrote about the human mind. He said that you are today where your thoughts have brought you, and you will be tomorrow where your thoughts take you. Not your circumstances, not your luck, not the opportunities you were or weren't given. Your thoughts. And most people who live in fear are not living there because the world is genuinely dangerous. They're living there because they have a thought habit, a deeply ingrained, constantly running, almost entirely unconscious habit of thinking in the direction of everything that could go wrong. Think about what happens in the mind of someone who is ruled by fear. They wake up, and before the day has even started, the mind is already running its program. What if today goes badly? What if I say the wrong thing? What if the thing I'm building doesn't work? What if people see that I don't know what I'm doing? What if I try and fail and everyone finds out? Those thoughts run like a background program, constant, automatic, so familiar they feel like facts rather than choices. And here is what James Allen understood about that. Every thought you think is a seed, and you're planting seeds every single moment of every single day, whether you realize it or not. whether you intend to or not, whether you like what's growing or not. The garden is always growing something. The question is whether you're deciding what gets planted. Most people who live in fear have been planting fear seeds for years, not because they wanted to, not because they made a conscious choice to fill their mind with worst-case scenarios, but because nobody ever taught them that they had a choice, that the thoughts running in the background of their life were not automatic and unchangeable facts, but habits. And habits can be interrupted, redirected, replaced. Now contrast that with the person who has learned to direct their thinking. They feel the same fear. They face the same uncertainty. They deal with the same doubts. None of that disappears just because you learn to think more deliberately. But they have learned to notice when the fear program starts running, and instead of following it down into the spiral, they interrupt it. Not with forced positivity, not with pretending everything is fine, not with a smile they don't feel, but with a question. Is this thought moving me toward where I want to go or away from it? That question, asked consistently every time the fear program starts running, is one of the most powerful things you can do with your mind, because it creates the distance James Allen was writing about, the space between the thought and the response, the moment of awareness that separates a person who is ruled by their thinking from a person who rules it. There was a woman named Claire. She had been afraid of being seen her whole life, afraid of being judged, of being criticized, of putting herself forward and having the world confirm the things she most feared about herself, that she wasn't enough. She had a voice, literally. She could sing in a way that stopped people, that made them pause whatever they were doing and just listen. And she had been hiding that voice for 27 years because the fear of being seen was louder than the desire to be heard. One day, she started paying attention to her thoughts, not changing them immediately, just watching them, just noticing what was actually running in the background of her mind. And what she found was startling. She was not just occasionally afraid. She was running a constant program of anticipatory failure. Every time she imagined singing for anyone, her mind immediately and automatically produced a vivid, detailed movie of everything going wrong. The judgment, the rejection, the humiliation, the confirmation of every fear she had ever had about herself. She had been watching that movie so many times, so automatically, that she had stopped realizing it was a movie. She thought it was a prediction. So she started doing something small. Every time a movie started playing, she would pause, and she would rewrite one scene, just one. She would take the moment of judgment and replace it with a moment of connection. Someone listening, really listening, and feeling something real. She didn't force herself to believe it immediately. She just practiced it the way you practice anything, imperfectly at first, with resistance, with the old program try to reassert itself. But consistently, every time the fear movie started, she would interrupt it and plant a different seed. Over time, something shifted. Not the fear entirely. The fear didn't disappear, but the movie changed. And when the movie changed, the feeling changed. And when the feeling changed, something in her changed. She sang publicly for the first time at 31 years old, in a small room, for a small audience, with her voice shaking and her hands gripping the microphone like it was the only solid thing in the world. And when it was over, and the room was quiet for one long second before the applause started, she understood something James Allen had been writing about for his entire life. The world you experience is built from the inside out. Change what's happening inside, and what's possible outside begins to change with it. So here's what I want you to do, not someday, today. Pay attention to the thoughts you're running about the thing you're most afraid of. Not to judge them, not to fight them, just to notice them, just to see clearly what you've been planting, what movie you've been watching, what program has been running in the background of your life. Because you cannot change what you cannot see. And once you can see it, once you can name the thought and recognize it as a habit rather than a fact, you have something you didn't have before, a choice. Now I want to tell you something that most people are not willing to hear, because it's uncomfortable, and it's the kind of truth that lands differently depending on whether you're ready for it or not. But if you've been here this long, I think you're ready. Here it is. Every year you spend obeying the fear. is a year you will never get back. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Of course, time passes. Of course, decisions have consequences. Of course, the years add up. But most people don't actually feel the weight of that truth. Not really, not in the way it needs to be felt to actually change something. They know it intellectually, the way you know that eating badly is bad for you, or that you should exercise more, or that the relationships that matter need to be tended. They know it, but they don't feel it. Not yet, not until they do. So I want you to do something right now, and I want you to actually do it, not just read it and move on. I want you to imagine yourself 20 years from now, not the version of you that finally got brave, not the version that took the leap and built the thing and became who you were always capable of being. The other version, the version that kept waiting, that kept telling themselves that someday, when the fear went away, when the timing was better, when the conditions were finally right, they would start. Picture that person, 20 years older, sitting somewhere quiet, looking back. What do they see? Not just the things they did, but the things they didn't, the conversations they never had, the risks they never took, the doors they stood in front of and never walked through, the version of themselves they caught glimpses of but never fully became, the business that stayed an idea, the relationship they never fought for, the voice they kept quiet, the life that could have been something extraordinary and instead became something safe and small and manageable and completely, utterly forgettable. James Allen wrote that you will become as small as your controlling desire, as great as your dominant aspiration. And the person in that image, that version of you 20 years from now, they became exactly as small as their fear allowed them to be. Not because they lacked talent, not because the world was unfair to them, not because the opportunities never came, because they kept obeying. Because every time a fear showed up and said not yet, they nodded and stepped back, and the years passed, and the possibilities narrowed, and the life that was supposed to be extraordinary quietly became ordinary, not with a bang, but with a long, slow whisper of maybe someday that never arrived. Now I want you to feel that, not intellectually, not as an abstract possibility, but as a real thing, a real cost, a real consequence of the decision you're making right now, today, by either choosing to move or choosing to wait. Because here is what most people don't realize until it's too late. You're not choosing between fear and no fear. That choice doesn't exist. The fear is coming either way. You are choosing between a life with fear that you moved through anyway and a life with fear that you obeyed. And those two lives look completely different 20 years from now. One of them has scars, has failures, has moments of embarrassment and rejection and getting it wrong. But it also has the things that only come to people who move, the growth, the stories, the relationships built through real risk, the quiet, deep satisfaction of knowing that when the moment came, you didn't shrink. The other life is safer, is smoother, has fewer visible failures. But it has something else too, something James Allen understood deeply and wrote about with the kind of quiet sadness that only comes from real understanding. It has regret, and regret, unlike failure, cannot be learned from, cannot be grown through, cannot be turned into something useful. Regret is just weight. The weight of the life that could have been, carried by the person who chose comfort over courage, safety over growth, the familiar voice of the fear over the quieter but truer voice of everything they were capable of. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not for me, not for anyone else, just for yourself, in the quiet of wherever you are right now. What is fear costing you? Not in theory, specifically in your actual life right now, today. What are you not doing because of it? Who are you not becoming because of it? What version of your life is sitting on the other side of the door you keep not walking through? Because that cost is real. It is accumulating right now, and it will keep accumulating for as long as you keep obeying. James Allen wrote that the greatest achievement was at first and for a time a dream. And the person who achieves it is not the person who waited until they felt ready. It is the person who decided that the cost of not trying was higher than the cost of failing. That person is not fearless. They're not special. They're not built differently than you. They just made a different calculation. And you can make it too. Right now, today, before this video ends, before the feeling fades, before the familiar comfort of the fear settles back in and whispers that you can think about it later. Now, now let's make this real. Because everything we've talked about today, the fear that lies, the exposure that shrinks it, the thoughts that feed it or starve it, the cost of obeying it for another year, another decade, another lifetime, all of that means nothing if it stays in your head. If it becomes one more piece of inspiration you consumed and then set down and walked away from unchanged. James Allen was very clear about this. He wrote that the good person does not desire material riches, but the acquisition of the strength and the wisdom necessary to overcome difficulties and attain right ends. And what he meant was that knowledge without action is not wisdom. It is just information, and you already have enough information. What you need now is a practice, something small, something real, something you can start tomorrow morning before the fear has had a chance to remind you of all the reasons to wait. So here's what I want you to do. The first thing, every single morning, before the phone, before the news, before anything else get the chance to speak, do one uncomfortable thing. Not a huge thing, not something that requires a complete life overhaul, just one thing that makes your heart beat a little faster, one thing that the voice inside you would rather avoid. It could be a message you've been putting off sending, a call you've been dreading making, 5 minutes of working on the thing you keep telling yourself you'll start someday. One sentence written toward the idea that's been living in your head for years. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that you do it before the fear has had a chance to negotiate with you, before the comfort of the morning has softened your resolve, before the day gives you a reason to postpone. Because here is what James Allen understood about the morning and what we talked about in another video on this channel. The way you begin is the way you become. And if you begin every morning by doing something the fear didn't want you to do, you're teaching your mind something profound about who you are. You're teaching it that you're someone who moves anyway. The second thing, when fear shows up during the day, and don't fight it, don't argue with it, don't try to think your way out of it. Just ask one question. Is this true, or is this just familiar? Because most of the time, if you're honest, the answer is just familiar. It's a story you've told yourself so many times it feels like fact, but it's not a fact, it's a habit, and habits can be interrupted. Ask the question, notice the answer, and then make a choice about whether you're going to keep following the story or start writing a different one. The third thing, at the end of each day, before you sleep, ask yourself one question. What did fear speak today, and what did I push back? Not to judge yourself, not to measure yourself against some standard of perfect courage, but to see clearly, to track the small victories, to notice the moments when you moved despite the fear, and let those moments become the evidence your brain needs to start believing a different story about who you are. Because the mind learns by watching you, and every time you act in the presence of fear, every time you move when the voice says stay, every time you speak when the voice says be quiet, every time you begin when the voice says wait, you're showing your mind something it will remember. We do hard things, we move anyway. We're not ruled by the feeling. James Allen wrote that he who would accomplish little must sacrifice little. He who would achieve much must sacrifice much. And what you are being asked to sacrifice here is not comfort entirely, not safety entirely, not the fear itself, because the fear will come regardless. What you're being asked to sacrifice is the obedience, the automatic, unquestioned, years-long habit of hearing the fear speak and treating it as a verdict rather than a signal. That is the only thing standing between where you are and where you are capable of being. Not the circumstances, not the opportunities, not the talent you do or don't have, not the timing, not the conditions, not anything outside of you. Just the obedience. And obedience is a choice, which means ending it is a choice too. A choice you can make right now, today, before this video ends, before the feeling fades, before tomorrow becomes the day you decide to start instead of today. Because there will always be a tomorrow to start. There will always be a reason to wait one more day, one more week, one more year, until the conditions are better, until the fear is quieter, until you feel more ready. And James Allen knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had studied the human mind deeply and honestly, that ready is not a feeling that arrives before you begin. It is a feeling that comes because you began. So this is the moment, not tomorrow, not when you finish thinking about it, not when you feel inspired enough to finally do something with what you've heard today. Now, one step, small enough to take today, real enough to matter, brave enough to count. The version of you that moved through the fear is not some distant future possibility. It is one decision away. And that decision is yours. It has always been yours. James Allen spent his life writing about this truth in simple, quiet words that have outlasted him by more than a century. Because the truth at the center of all of it does not age, does not go out of style, does not become less relevant as the world changes around it. You are what you think, and you can change what you think. And when you change what you think, you change what you do. And when you change what you do, you change who you become. And who you become is the only thing that was ever really at stake. The fear does not get a vote in that. Not anymore. Not unless you give it one. So don't. Take the step. Make the call. Send the message. Write the first sentence. Have the conversation. Walk through the door. Do it afraid. Do it imperfectly. Do it without certainty or guarantees or any promise that it will work out the way you hope. Just do it. Because on the other side of the fear you've been obeying, the life you've been describing to yourself in quiet moments when nobody is listening, that life is real, it is possible, it is closer than the fear has been telling you. And it is waiting for you to decide that you are done letting fear decide for you. If this video moved something in you, if something you heard today made you stop and think, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this and subscribe to the channel. There is so much more to explore together. See you in the next one.